There we go. We are live. A very warm welcome to anybody who's joining us, whether there's anybody joining us live or whether you're watching this after the event. So this is, I'm Graham. I host a radio show on Space Sound Radio called the Whisky Rev Blues. And a couple of months ago, I got an email out the blue from Robert Forsyth, who is joining me today on the show. And it was to advertise Robert's new book, which is So Many Roads, The Life of Pete Haycock, and Robert was kind enough to send me a copy of the book, which I devoured, and I was convicted. I think you know this, Robert. I was convicted by how, as a blues radio host, how little I knew about Climax Blues Band, but about the band, the guitarist Pete Haycock in particular. So Robert has very kindly agreed to come on to our YouTube channel and to have a chat. But we'll just chat through Pete's life, and hopefully anybody who's watching will be able to benefit and to learn as much as I have as well. Welcome to the Whisky Rev Blues, Robert.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thanks for inviting me on. Great stuff.
So the purpose of this, we're just going to have a chat. And I mean, Robert, I expect you'll do most of the talking because you're the one with the knowledge. But what, if I might ask initially, what sparked your interest in Pete Haycock? Because I know you've written a couple of books already about the Climax Blues Band. So what prompted this?
Well, it was really an extension of that. Pete went on to enjoy a varied career after he left the Climax Blues Band. I never consciously set out to write a book about Pete Haycock, but I do feel that he, and I know this is an oft-used expression, underrated, but I know it's a subjective thing, but I really do feel that Pete Haycock was Britain's kind of great lost blues guitarist. I mean, I'm a fanboy. I mean, I just love the band and I love Pete's playing. I think personally he's up there with Peter Green. I think he's up there with Eric Clapton. And he's up there with all those sort of greats, Bernie Marsden, or Robin Trower maybe going a bit left of field, but I mean Pete's up there with them, and I think it's probably realistic and fair to say that he didn't over promote himself. He was, I think, I never met him. I saw him play on a couple of occasions, but from talking to many people while I was writing and researching the book, he came over as, to me, rightly or wrongly, as a bit of a self-effacing man, and a modest man, not without humor, but self-promotion, possibly a little bit of British reserve, I think.
I as somebody who is, I suppose, becoming a bit of a fanboy just as a consequence of reading the book, and it is, I should say, for anybody who's watching, we've got 4 people who are watching. I should say that there's a chat room at the side. If you want to ask a question at any point, type in your question and we'll chat them. But when you read the book, I kept having to put it aside in order to go and listen to a song that was referred to, because I wasn't aware of the chronological order of the albums, and to listen to each of the songs as you go through. But at the beginning, the early stuff, there is a clear sense that you've got this young man who is supremely talented, and I know it's a mixture of natural talent and hard work and practice, but it does read like everybody round about him can see the potential of that talent long before he thinks that he might be able to make a career out of it.
Yeah, well, there's an episode in, so basically, I mean, a bit of background, the band Pete and most of his fellow band members, the core of the band, Derek Holt, Colin Cooper, they hailed from the Stafford area. And I mean, the Midlands was a great incubator of music, blues music and blues rock music. 1960s R&B within the Midlands, in the context of the Midlands. It was a powerhouse of blues and blues music, and there were a lot of venues, and when Pete was a young man, barely 17, the band that not quite his schoolboy band, but he formed with some friends, very young friends, a band called Mason Dixon, named after the American.
Excuse me.
And Mason Dixon were able, Colin Cooper, who founded the Climax Blues Band, or as it was then the Climax Chicago Blues Band, originally had a band called the Climax Jazz Band, and from that became the Blues Band. And they were quite a band on the Midland circuit, and they would get to play venues further away from Stafford. And when they did that, Colin suggested to Mason Dixon that they fill in. And on more than one occasion, Mason Dixon found themselves supporting the Graham Bond organization, the great Graham Bond organization. And, you know, Ginger Baker and Dick Hextall Smith and Jack Bruce. And there was one occasion, you may have read it in the book, where, you know, Dick Hextall Smith particularly and Jack Bruce really noticed Pete. And they said, you know, you should get in touch. In fact, they took Pete's number, and they wanted him to get in touch with Alexis Corner down in London, because they saw something there in this 17-year-old kid, like, so as you say, so many people did. And but I think again, Pete was Stafford born and bred, and I think he felt, and I don't mean this in any disparaging way, I think he felt safe with the familiar terrain that he was, that area, his homeland. But yeah, a lot of people saw that talent. And in fact, when I was researching and writing the book, it was, and also when I was doing the band, the histories of the band, that early period in Stafford was when the Climax Blues, what became the Climax Blues Band, formed in Stafford. That was because I listened to the Climax Blues Band I discovered them in about 76. And so I started listening to them I remember listening to them on Radio Caroline, you know, the British pirate station that was anchored on a rusty old boat in the North Sea. And they put me on. I heard this. I was listening to Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and you know, I was a rock, you know. And then one day on Caroline, they played this song, and I thought, that's different. That's great. And it was a track from the Gold Plated album by Climax Blues Band, which had their hit single "Couldn't Get It Right" on. And I think what it was, you know, we'll come on to this, but I maybe subconsciously heard the blues for the first time. It was like a bridge. The band were like a bridge for me between rock and my eventual interest in the blues. So when I came to write the book and do the research, without any intention, I found myself getting so interested before that 70s rock period, going back to the 60s, and how these guys, because it was such an exciting time, there were so many bands out there, you know, Fleetwood Mac was forming, Chicken Shack, I mean, there's Humble Pipes, you know, Savoy Brown, all these guys that just, and the music is just, you know, so wild and yeah, psychedelic a little bit, but it's just brilliant music. And I found, you know, I wanted, finding Climaxes and Pete's place in that was an unexpected bonus to researching the story. And I really like looking back to that 60s period. And he was.
And the thread that runs through all of that stuff is the blues, isn't it? I mean, it might become less recognizable as bands go on and they make their own sound, but the book's called "So Many Roads Through Blues," man, and blues although like so many, at times he kind of deviates away from it. There's one or two bits I know in his career where he sort of deviated a little bit away from blues, was a bit more adventurous, almost under pressure from, like, I think Warner at one point were looking for something a bit different and tried different things. But he always, I mean, he was a true blues man, wasn't he?
Yeah, and in his later career, towards his final years, he went back. There's a kind of, I don't know what the word is, a paradox or a juxtaposition, because each member, I mean, if you include the three front men, if that's right, I mean, they had some fantastic rhythm sections, and drummers were superb, but out front it was Pete, Colin Cooper, and for the core period, Derek Holt on bass. And they had fantastic harmonies. They were just superb, all three of them, superb songwriters. And I think it's fair to say Colin was the purist in terms of blues. And I think Pete learnt a lot from Colin and developed his. There were two or three individuals, I think Pete took his influences. There was the Climax Blues Band's first drummer, and the drummer with Mason Dixon was a guy called George Newsom, who was a very authoritative blues enthusiast, and he had a record collection, and he used to go down to London at weekends and buy blues records in the West End shops in the West End and bring them back. And he introduced Pete to a lot of stuff, as did Colin Cooper. And I mean, I've had the privilege of seeing Colin Cooper, the late Colin Cooper's record collection, and it's just stunning. He's a real both those guys are pure bluesmen, and they had an influence on Pete. But Pete in himself was a bit of an experimentalist. I think he wanted to, as you said, the Warner years, we can come on to that, but the later years when they were under pressure a little bit to produce FM friendly album rock for the United States market, I think Pete had to do different things, and he partly enjoyed it and partly didn't. And he's a guitar player. And then Derek Holt is a songwriter. They're all songwriters, but Derek Holt is a particularly good songwriter and lyricist. So those three strengths and three different strands came together to, I think, benefit that band.
Yeah, and it was like the perfect mix. I think, if he'd gone down a different road, then he maybe would have been a rock musician or whatnot. But these early influences. So just to let folk know who are watching, in preparation for this, we don't have a license to play songs here on YouTube, but for the radio show and on Mixcloud afterwards, we will. And I'd asked Robert to come up with some tracks that best represented both Pete on guitar, either solo or with the band, and one or two others that were part of influences, some of his early influences. And there's a couple of those that you had picked. Do you want to say anything about now? One of Little Walter and
well, in his early years, in his formative years, and it surprised me actually when I was researching, because we're talking about a guy who was a guitar player. Pete was a guitar player, but one of his earliest influences, it was Little Walter, and if you look at you don't know what the word is, the historiography, and when I researched the book, Pete didn't do too many videoed interviews, screen interviews. Most of the material that I had to draw on was from the written word, and in various interviews, 3 or 4 times, interviews he gave to American journalists when Climax was on tour in the States, he cites Little Walter. Little Walter was he calls him Little Walter was the governor, and he had when he was a kid, he had a box of he just had a box in the house. There was a box of just stuff, and in it was he had a little toy, a little harmonica, and he heard My Babe and Duke and stuff like that, and I think that set him on his way before the guitar, actually. Yeah.
I wonder how many musicians of all genres would be able to trace something back to Little Walter.
Yeah, yeah.
And Otis Rush as well. You mentioned as well in one of the tracks that you've picked. So how did it get then from the Mason Dixon? How does that morph into Climax? How did his career go from 17-year-old kid in Stafford? And one of the things about the book, as well as listening to music, I was drawn in it, and I ended up going on to Google Maps, and you can go and see the places that you mentioned in the book, including, quite sad, but his old school. You can go and, of course, in Google Earth, stand outside, and it's all fenced off now. I guess it's for demolition or whatever, but you're kind of drawn into, you can see where he lived, and you can get a very quick flavour of the kind of, just the sort of demographic that it would have been, and it must have been a big thing for him to move from that.
Well, I mean, Stafford was an industrial, one of Britain's industrial heartlands. I mean, we're talking Pete was born in 1951, January 1951, I think, from memory. And so the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, I mean, it was a place where they made shoes, where there was a lot of glue. I mean, Pete worked for a glue company when he left school. When he left that school, King Edward's Grammar School, in the great Gothic, dark brick building in Stafford. And it was an industrial powerhouse, I suppose, in Britain. And there was and I think, along with that came the housing and the pubs and the senses of community. And those guys are very loyal to where they came from. So what happened was that Colin Cooper, the saxophonist, and the guy with the very deep, rich voice, main singer in club, the main man, really. He formed the band. Colin Cooper formed the band. He had set up an earlier band, and featured, by coincidence, members other musicians who would play with Climax, and he just wanted to change direction, and he wanted to set up a blues band, and he just contacted Pete and said, I want to play Chicago blues. Do you? And Pete by now had been drenched by Little Walter and Otis Rush and all these guys.
He's in the zone.
Yeah, and B.B. King, and it was the right moment. And Pete said, yeah, I want to do it. And, Colin was, trying to think, I can't remember when Colin was born in 1939. And Pete was 51. So that, that's, Colin had years on Pete. And I think was possibly a bit of a father figure as well. But anyway, these guys just hit it off. And Pete left Mason Dixon, which kind of naturally folded. I think it had reached the end of the road. And Climax was born. And through various, and Pete's drummer with Mason Dixon, George Newson, came along, and Derek Holt was in Stafford as well. He was a Staffordian, so he joined the band. There was a keyboards guy called Richard Jones, also from Stafford. He joined the band, and they set off. And it was a time when blues bands were. It was a rare, wonderful time, the late 60s, when you had Fleetwood Mac and bands like that, and blues was quite, I hate to use this word, but trendy, and some record labels were pulling in quite big acts. And
we did the blues revival, the folk revival in America, and everything.
Absolutely, and influenced by those Delta musicians and traditional musicians and folk blues artists in the States. And Britain kind of slightly electrified it and put its own mark on that, I think. but so basically, EMI Parlophone was, Parlophone was looking for a blues band, and they had a young producer. I mean, they had a producer, it was a gentleman called Chris Martin, but he had an assistant called Chris Thomas. And Martin went away on holiday and said, well, I'm away, get a blues band. So Chris Thomas thought, I better find a blues band. And it just so happened that by that stage, Climax had got a manager kind of thing, and they'd gone off down to Cornwall just for a few days break, and they were going to play in a couple of pubs or something down there. It was in the summer, and let's all go off down to Cornwall. And before they left, Pete Riley, who was their manager, just put an advert in the Melody Maker, as was what people did in those days, saying, blues band looking for, to further their career, blah, blah, blah. And Chris Thomas noticed this and contacted them. And when they got back and they said, we're available. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they went down to London, to Abbey Road, and did an audition, and Chris Thomas liked them. They went back to Stafford. They got the call saying, I think we should take this further. And then they went back down to Abbey Road, and they cut their debut album, Climax Chicago, his eponymous album, Climax Chicago Blues Band. And they were going down the M, whatever it was, down, I suppose the M1 eventually, the relatively newly completed motorway down to London, and they were still writing songs, and these guys they had jobs, and they weren't pro, and just that wonderful thing that happened in the 60s, we're going down to Abbey Road to make an album, but we're still writing songs on the way down there, to put on the album. And that's what they did. And while they were there, the Beatles were wrapping up the White Album and all that went with that. But they happened to, Paul McCartney was there and came in and watched them, which must have been amazing if you're a young guy from Stafford, and the rest is history, as they say. That was their first album. It got them off the blocks.
That was 69, isn't it? 1969.
Yeah, the band formed effectively it formed in 68. They got together and they did their rehearsals in Walton Village Hall. And
because one of the tracks you picked, and it must have been hard to pick up off that album, how many more years was on that album, wasn't it?
Well, I wanted to pick that song because it's the blues, it's what they were trying. It's Howlin' Wolf. It's an interesting rendition. It represents what they were aspiring to. It was very difficult to pick songs, but I think that's why I picked that song. It's what they were It's what they were aspiring to be, and it's representative of that.
But it shows that how good they are, doesn't it? Because if you pick a track that's a well-known track, but even by 1969, it was a blues classic. And if you're going to do that, and if you do it badly, I mean, if you don't do it well, the blues aficionados are going to tear you to pieces, right? But I mean, they took it and they put their own slant on it, and it's clearly Pete Haycock's guitar, but nevertheless, it's still Howlin' Wolf's song. Still, many more years. That's skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris Thomas, I think, he was quite tough with them. He had his own preconceptions. The second album, Plays On, went slightly more psychedelic and has, so I believe it has Chris Thomas's footprint on it more, whereas the first album was very sort of more of a traditional blues album. But Chris Thomas was quite, he wanted things done in a certain way. And I think it was one of those happy things where Chris Thomas worked for them, and he worked for and they worked for Chris Thomas. So it was just a happy meeting.
Yeah.
But
But it doesn't sound as though at any point, I know we're talking about Pete particularly, but the whole of that group didn't seem at all scared of hard work. I mean, you're exhausted reading it, how many times they they performed, and then they wrote and toured. They just seem to be willing to roll up their sleeves, put in the miles, put in the hours, and
Yeah, that's what I found astonishing when I wrote both the band book and So Many Roads is just how often they were out there. They were away from home. It's probably like being in the Navy or the Merchant Navy or something. They're away from home for months, and there were two distinct phases. There was the first 4 albums when basically it was UK and Europe touring, and Pete Riley was managing them, and they were slogging around Britain. And Derek Holt remembers, meeting at the Watford Gap services on the M1, and all at 2 a.m. in the morning, and there'd be bands because apparently the place stayed open, and they'd all be meeting up in the early hours of the morning. There'd be, Fleetwood Mac and Climax and, Graham Bond and whatever, and they'd all meet there, and, it would be a fry up and get some carbs in, and then they'd be back in the van and back up to the Midlands. But it was done again and again and again, week, and, they had to load all their own gear and load it out, and places where they played in the early days, such as Eel Pie Island down in London, it was a nightmare because there was a little bridge that went over to Eel Pie Island, and Anton Farmer, who joined the band in 71, who was a keyboards player and a damn fine Hammond organ player, he's told me, Jesus, getting a Hammond organ, which is a great lump of a thing, over this narrow little bridge, because you couldn't get a vehicle over it, into the venue at Eel Pie Island on the was terrible. And they were doing this, all the bands were. There was nothing, Climax weren't the only band doing it, but it was a whole thing. And then that was the first phase, and then the second phase was when Miles Copeland became their manager, and he got Wishbone Ash, and he got Renaissance, and a couple of other acts like that, Curved Air, and Climax sort of slotted into his empire, and they did 13 tours of the States, and they were away for long stretches, and they recorded,
sorry, no, on you go.
And they recorded 3 albums in the States as well. Is that right? 3 albums in the States and 1 in Montserrat. But they were away for a long time. And they were a road band. And bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd and ZZ Top, moving forward into the 70s, Skynyrd, ZZ Top, Johnny Winter, Aerosmith, bands like that, and other British acts like Fleetwood Mac, Peter Frampton, who were touring the States. Bad Company, they did a tour, not a particularly satisfactory tour, but they did a tour with Bad Company, joint heading. Those bands wanted Climax because Climax could warm up an arena-sized audience. Because that's another thing, that the difference between playing in the US and playing in the UK and Europe, you play the Marquee Club in London, or the Eel Pie Island Club in Richmond, or you go and play a venue in Hamburg, a fairly big venue, or Frankfurt or Paris or wherever, and there'd be a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people. And then suddenly you'd be on a plane to the States, and there'd be thousands of students, universities. It was just. I remember. There's a guy called Bo Overlord who became a friend of the band, and he's an American, and he was at university on the East Coast, and he was responsible for the entertainment, for the Ents, for his university. And the band were on their first tour, 1973, to the US, and they played New York, I think, somewhere in New Jersey. And when they were there, the way these things happened, someone just got them a gig at Bowes University. They weren't, so they said, oh yeah, we're available, we'll do it. And Bowes said, you know, these guys, these British guys, you know, they went into the campus and there was some kind of place where you could buy food. And there were cheeseburgers and tacos and southern fried chicken. And Bo just said, you've never seen a group of guys just wolf food down so much, because it was a new thing to them. You know, they had Wimpy and that was about it. So it was a huge cultural difference for those guys when they went to the States. And you're talking about 73, 74, and then from 75 onwards, they started doing more tours, and they went to America a lot. The tours were getting bigger and more and lengthier, but they were away for a long time.
Yeah, there is the sense when you read through it, of course, when they go there and initially they're not the headliners, and then as it goes forward, you're kind of waiting for that to happen, because I mean they're not. You know, it's not like your kind of Leonard Skinners or the Yacht and Climax where the kind of the dinghy bouncing along behind. I mean, they deserve their place on those stages, but you're kind of thinking at some point this is going to happen. At some point they're going to become. It kind of doesn't happen, and yet they deserved it, and people around them could clearly see it. Some of the other bands, I mean, it mentions in the book how Leonard Skinner were like the best friends of the Climax Blues Band, and all these other guys clearly gave them respect, recognized the talent, and it just seems to stop short.
You know, as a fan of the band and Pete, it's the thing that breaks my heart, has broken my heart constantly over the years, is you say to people, Climax Blues Band, and at worst you just, you know, you're met with a blank look, and at best you get, oh yeah, I've heard of them, and then you say couldn't get it right, and people say, oh yeah, that's right, I remember them, and you think, oh god. I think what happened in the States particularly, Graham, was that there were three kind of levels of gig, if you like. There was the gig where they were doing a smaller venue and it was Climax heading. Yeah, some of the Midwest venues, the smaller venues, they were heading. There was a lot of alternate joint headers with bands, Barclay James Harvest, Renaissance, Wishbone Ash, Manfred Mann's Earth Band, where one would be the main act one night and then Climax the other night. And then the next level was going out with the likes of Lynyrd Skynyrd and ZZ Top and Johnny Winter and people like that, where Climax were the opening, the warm-up act. And yeah, I don't know why. I have no answer to that. Such supreme talent. I just think they just were modest men. And
it might come back to that. You mentioned his lack of self-promotion in that way, because I get the impression that whatever stage you put him on, he would come up with the goods. You know, you put him on the stage, he would sing, he would play, everybody would be mesmerized, and then he would go off, and it didn't matter whether you put him on at a local pub hall or something like that, or whether he was on a stage in a stadium. He would produce, but he didn't seem to. I don't know. I don't want to make out it was a lack in him, but something was missing in the sort of stand up to me kind of, I'm great at this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when he came off the stage, he was just Pete Haycock from Stafford again. You know, he wasn't the rock star. I think that applied to all of them, really. I mean, I think they liked it. I think they enjoyed, you know, they were lucky guys. I mean, they went out to, you know, the first band to record at Air Studios in Montserrat. I mean, they did taste the good life. But at the end of the day, and all of them, I was going to say Pete especially, but all of them, they were, I just think they were modest. They just didn't want, they just, I mean, there was a bit of drink. There was a bit of smoky stuff. But they didn't smash up hotels, and, you know, they just not that many bands did, but they just didn't want that. They talk very fondly about the night when Lynyrd Skynyrd got them so ballistically inebriated on their private jet, two of them anyway, and they wrote a song about it called Champagne and Rock and Roll. And but apart from that, and there was I think you probably read about it in the book, there was an incident when they got thrown in jail in Mexico, on the Mexican border, which none of them really forgot. That wasn't very pleasant.
No, that must have been quite scary.
Yeah. One of their roadies had a little Panama Red secreted, and they found it, and they spent a very unpleasant, I think it was about 48 hours or something, in awful conditions, really bad conditions in a jail on the Mexican border, just over the border. But apart from that, they were family men, and I think they like going home as much as they like being on the road. And I think towards. So you mentioned Warner's. Warner's were interested in them, and they did a 5 or 6 album deal with Warner Brothers, and they parted ways with Miles Copeland, who, Pete Riley, their first manager, and I don't mean this in any derogatory sense, served a purpose. He got them their first album deal. He negotiated with EMI, and along comes Miles Copeland, and everything that Miles Copeland was, this sort of enigmatic, mercurial guru type figure. And there were 3 brothers, including Stuart Copeland, drummer of the Police, and went on to become drummer of the Police. And Stuart Copeland, did a lot of promotion work, and they got that single "Couldn't Get It Right," which got them well known. And then Warner's came along, and suddenly it was a mega bucks 5 or 6 album deal, 5 album deal. But in like so many bands, that then introduces the problems. And they'd always been an equitable band. They'd always shared royalties. And I think it's fair to say that Colin Cooper and Pete Haycock were, Derek as well, the prime songwriters. And they'd been happy splitting the money. But a man entered the scene that was put there by Warner Brothers, and without going too much into the murkiness of it all, let's just say he stirred the pot and said, look, the guy who writes the song should receive something more than just the standard amount, split, that standard share. And this penny went in the slot, I think, unfortunately. And that was combined with the fact that in the States, to get anywhere, you had to get on FM radio. To get on FM radio,
you need the single.
You need the single. Yeah. And I think those, and so, they got this new agreement going about splitting the money, and I think Pete and Colin were happy about that because they'd made a major contribution to the band's songwriting. But then one of the other band members, Derek Holt, plays an ace and comes up with a song called "I Love You," which is a wonderful ballad as a song, perhaps not, in fairness, perhaps not representative of the blues output of the band historically, but the band's output was having to change necessarily for the US market. So there were a lot of dynamics going on. And Derek came up with this. Well, I've written this song, and he handed this guy from this American producer who had flown over from the States this cassette, and he said, "I've written this," and the guy just loved it and said, he saw cha-chung single, and that unfortunately was one of the that didn't rest well with Colin and Pete as well. And this is where you reach this next stage of the band. Are we a blues band? Are we a rock band? Are we an American FM yacht rock? They had photographs of themselves taken in roll neck jumpers on a yacht off the coast of California. So are we a blues band? Are we a blues rock band? Are we a rock band? Are we a yacht rock band? What are we? And I think they probably there was a little bit of uncertainty about the whole thing. But then the Americans want the single because they wanted it for FM radio, and Derek comes up with the goods.
It's interesting you mentioned California, because we've got just a comment in the chat room. Donner Pass Whiskey saying good morning from California. So we're being joined from California. But and reading the story, the bit about Derek Holt, it almost sounds, if I read it correctly, like not quite an afterthought, but they hadn't really. So they've got the pressure to write the single, and neither Pete or Colin are come up with something that the American producers particularly impressed with, and it almost sounds like they were about to go home, and Derek kind of went, "Well, I've got this, if that's any good."
Yeah, that's right. And it was in Colin's home studio, and Derek is a brilliant songwriter. He's a lyricist. He's a fabulous songwriter. I mean, they all were. I mean, and he's a brilliant musician. He's a great singer. And it was just in him, and he came up with the goods, and it was what the American Warner's man wanted to hear. And he said, "This is going to make you. This will help. This will see you all right." So they kind of went, "Okay," but then the blues, I was going to use the word faction, but that's too strong. The blues sentimentalists within the band, Pete and Colin, I think it was possibly a little bit of a bridge too far for them to. I mean, the 90s, Graham, we're talking now about the late 70s. It was, it was a think times were changing. There was American bands like Boston, Kansas. There was a sort of slickness to American rock, and if you wanted to make the money and make a living out of things, you couldn't just live off the marquee in London or a venue in Hamburg. If you were serious, you had to do this. So there was a degree of compromise, I think. And they did it, but it didn't sit well, particularly with Colin, and he had his reasons. And unfortunately, that was the slippery slope. And
it's sad to watch. I mean, in the book, you're kind of seeing it in slow motion, and the inevitable history. But of course, when Warner bought them out the contract, and and then Virgin, and was it Virgin? It was Virgin that 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, Derek they lost Derek Holt, Tony Brinsley, who had been their manager, very organized man with the purse strings and contracts, and he was involved in negotiating things, as I understand it, with Warner. Chris Runciman, their very experienced road manager, Neil Kirby, their sound manager. One by one, these guys who were they were a close unit. One by one, those guys went, and sadly, and it was down to just Pete and Colin and John Cuffley, the original drummer, a superb drummer, jazz drummer. I mean, you listen to some of John's work on the albums, it's phenomenal, especially on albums like Reel to Reel, which was the album they recorded in Montserrat. And it's a story, but they signed over to Virgin. It was a guy who had been fixing a promotions guy who was fixing gigs in the UK and I think in Germany as well. And he sort of said, look, Virgin will be interested. So yeah, they went over to Virgin. They released an album called Sample and Hold in 83, I think it was, which was all right. It was different. Again, it was an album for the time. The artwork, the sleeve artwork was a bit, but you know, it's not exactly a Marmite album, but it's again, it's not the blues. It's there is a blues undertone to it, but it's very much an 80s feel. And that album took a long time to make. I think they were getting over the repercussions of losing Derek and a lot of the other the team that they'd had that went around the States with them. And eventually, because of money, because of the time it took, the studio hire, they brought in a George Glover who joined the band on keyboards. But it cost it took a lot of time and a lot of money, and they just never recouped it. And unfortunately, as with so many things in life, that caused this eventually the split between, such a shame, between Pete and Colin. And Pete just decided to leave. And Colin was a blues man, and Colin wanted to continue with the band, and he did that. And Pete went off and walked down a different road, and that's why I've called the book So Many Roads, because ironically, this song which he so many times, there were so many roads, and then he walked down this different road.
And the pressures come across really clearly, I think. And I mean, one of the ones that I probably wouldn't have appreciated, even if I'd known the chronological history of the band, was the financial pressures. Because it talks about how, you know, by the time they get into 1982, 1983, and they're still performing, they're working really hard, but the debt has built up. The chapter, the really sad chapter in the book, I think it's called 6 Months Wasted, isn't it? Where they spend 6 months making an album. They walk in to see the record company, and the record company have forgotten to tell them that we're not interested in you anymore. So they have wasted six. So they've got all the financial pressures. They've got the tensions of creativity.
And that haunted Graham. That haunted Pete to the point that on his first solo album, there's a song called Young Executives, because it's a cynical song about the young executives at the time who worked in the music industry, and specifically it was aimed at people who would work. It was aimed at Virgin, basically. That hurt him. He was. I think I mentioned it in the book. A couple of people said to me that they felt Pete had been damaged by the business, almost more so than, you know, any ruptures with Colin, Derek, or his old friends, and they were old friends. This is beside that, the thing that I think he felt the business was nasty at the end of the day, and I think there was an element of him that said, I'm going to go out on my own, and I'm going to plow my own furrow, maybe in a smaller way, but I'm not going to take risks, and I'm not going to. He had to earn a living. He had a family in Stafford, and the only thing he could do was pick up his guitar and play. So he formed the Pete Haycock band, and he was joined in that by an excellent bassist called Livingston Brown, some guys called Ian Dunnett, Kev McCulloch, Mike Stevens, Clive Mayuyu on drums. You know, again, names that don't necessarily resonate, but when you listen to their music, just superb musicians. And Miles Copeland always stayed in sort of, not always, but he never quite let Pete go, and Pete was brought in for this thing called Night of the Guitars, which was this big guitar jamboree set up by Miles Copeland, which featured, Andy Turner from Wishbone Ash, Robbie Krieger from The Doors, Leslie West from Mountain, Steve Hunter, Alvin Lee. There were all these names slightly from these old heroes, these old war horses, and he put them on the road and did a couple of nights in the UK, and then put them on later on the road in Europe. And Pete was sort of part of that. Was he floundering a bit in the 1980s? Yes, I think he was, right up to 1990, really. And then he got, of course, a man called Hans Zimmer comes along.
That must be, when you read the story, it's the most unlikely development. I mean, if you think of Hans Zimmer soundtracks, and I don't tend to think of them in the same genre as what Pete Haycock had done up until that point.
Well, Hans Zimmer was a big, like I was a big fan of Climax, and particularly he was a fan of Pete Haycock, and he mentions it a couple of times. It was his dream, as he said, to work with Pete. And I think Pete, I was going to say gun for hire, but that's a little bit too cruel, I think. But Pete, needs must. And Pete was an excellent guitar player. I mean, superb. And he was available at the right time. And Zimmer was working on, Hans Zimmer's career was taking off. Thelma and Louise, Driving Miss Daisy. And as I mentioned to you earlier, there was there was a soundtrack which he wrote for a movie called K2, which is a mountaineering film. And I don't listen to it often, but whenever I listen to it, it just blows me away. I mean, it's kind of like a blues symphony almost, and it's an action film set on this mountain, and it's all taut ropes and guys slipping on ice and all the rest of it, and he makes that sound real in his guitar. It's stunning. I mean, with Zimmer as well, with Zimmer's production work as well, and his writing, but it's just, and it demonstrates to me what an accomplished musician Pete was. But always the blues is there. Always, it's just in there somewhere, and it's almost like I'm having to butter my bread. I'm having to, look after my family. I'm having to earn money. Yeah. And it was a difficult time for blues bands, the 1980s, 1990s. No one really wanted blues. Not until, Coca-Cola or, some coffee ad or something suddenly discovered John Lee Hooker, boom, 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 or whatever. And then suddenly the blues becomes trendy again. No, Pete had to do what he had to do. And I think he did it very well.
That soundtrack I listened to after our first chat, and so the ability to communicate emotion without words, just with the music, and that's a rare gift to have, to the extent that it comes across in a soundtrack like K2. But it's an emotional, which I suppose is what the blues is all about, isn't it? It's about telling a story and conveying an emotion.
Yes. I'm not I don't know about you, Graham, but I'm not a great, if you said to me, listen to an instrumental or listen to a vocal track, I always probably go for the vocal. I admit that I don't gravitate towards, a lot of instrumental music, although I'll happily listen to, say, Deep Purple when they go off on one of their 15-minute, Richie Blackmore is just, I'll listen to that, but it's in the context of a vocal piece. Yeah. And yet Pete, there's just something about his playing, maybe because it has that blues influence, that I can just put his music on any time of day, and just like a glove. It just goes over your hand, and it's, to use a metaphor, it's wonderful music. And then towards the end of his life, he makes a statement because he went off in various. He did some production work for a very disparate group of people. Gary Newman he was involved with. There was a sort of folk proggy. There was a young band who was sort of psych folk music. He produced their album. He got involved with a kind of real 12-bar blues, dirty, bar band in the States, just real gut bucket blues. He produced their album. He was extremely flexible and a very talented producer. He produced The Sun Was Setting, but he produced music for Chicken Shack, and he was a very talented man. But towards the end of his life, he makes a statement because he forms a band called True Blues. And I love the way that it just happened. He was out buying by this stage, he'd moved to Germany and he was living in Frankfurt. And he was out one evening with his partner to buy some cigarettes. And he just heard this guy playing outside a bar. And it turned out the guy was an Englishman in Germany from Sheffield. And he went up to the guy and said, I like your music. And the guy looked at him and said, well, okay, who are you? You're English. And he said, I'm Pete Haycock. And the guy said, Climax? And he said, yeah. And they got on and they formed a band called True Blues with an Irish bassist and a German drummer.
Is that the guy who walked up and he said, you sound like me?
Yeah, you sound like me. Yeah, yeah. And Glenn Turner is there's a guy called Stefan Raut who knew Pete very well in Germany, one of Pete's great friends. And I mentioned in the book, but if you go onto if you Google and go onto YouTube, there's a performance in a little bar in Dusseldorf where Pete plays So Many Roads. Graham, urge your listeners to watch it. It is just stunning. It's underrated. It's just a little bar in Dusseldorf, and I just wish I'd been there. And that is the blues. That's kind of where sadly he signed off, really. Playing with it, he had a blues band, and he said I was at my happiest. He'd been through all these, he'd been in a band environment. He released 3 or 4 solo albums. He'd flirted with jazz. He'd written soundtracks. But in the end, it was the blues, and that's what he went back to. And I think that last band is he you can tell he was his happiest, and he's most maybe not his happiest, but his most natural. And I think I listened to that album again and again, and yeah.
And he wasn't. I mean, he was only 62 when he died, wasn't he? But he wasn't ill. It was as far as I can read, it was a sudden.
As a sudden thing, it was his heart. Yeah, just gave out. I don't. It's funny when you write a biography. If you're writing a biography of a historical figure, someone who died 100 years or more ago, or you kind of maybe you feel safer. But I just felt Pete was. It was too near and too. I found it. I didn't like getting to that part in the book.
I get it.
It was not nice. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened. It just shouldn't have happened. And what would he be doing now? What, if he was, but yeah, I think he just ended. If he was still here today, I think he'd be probably in production work. because he seemed to enjoy that.
And he would only be what, 73, maybe 74.
Yeah,
He turned 74 this year, but
yeah.
51.
And he loved what he did. He loved his home studios. And again, when he moved to Germany, he was working initially with the most rudimentary. He was working from a bedroom, and he didn't have a problem with that. He didn't have any problem with that. He just, and then he went to I believe a basement room in an apartment block in Germany, and two guys, Jeff Byler, who runs the Pete Haycock Appreciation Society Facebook page, and Reg Godwin, who's a fellow Staffordian who ran Pete's website for a while. They both visited him in Germany, and the impression I get from Jeff and Reg is that he was happy there and he just loved making music. And I think impression I get, rightly or wrongly, is that he was slowly leaning more to production work and writing. And his idea of having fun was going out to play in a bar and playing blues in a bar. He'd done all the stadiums and the Lynyrd Skynyrd's and the ZZ Tops. He'd done all that. And I think he enjoyed it. And he was a showman. I mean, he got quite, when he was on stage, the Mexican silver and the white flowing hair and his trademark aluminium bodied, gold plated, at least one was gold plated.
The Villano.
Yeah, the Villano guitar with the fork, with the V headstock. I mean, he and the big belt buckle, he could do it. He could. Girls loved him, and he had a presence, and he was a younger man, and but he was never a rock. I wouldn't say that any of them were rock stars. I don't really think that was their thing, really.
Well, it does seem to be all about the music, and I know that maybe sounds like a flippant remark, but when you think about them going up and down the motorway, and they're not doing it for money, because at that point at the beginning, there's no money on the table. And then when they're plowing through it, and even when they are doing the big things, money's still a consideration. We look at those days, and we look at the Led Zeppelins and their private jets and all the rest. But here, the Climax Blues Band working is hard, producing is good stuff, but they've not got the money. And then all the way through, you just get this picture of a man who's like, I don't have the money, but I love doing this, and I'm going to keep doing it. And the soundtrack's because he does need an income.
Yeah,
but there's a real super respect for that.
Yeah. I also remember when I first met Derek Holt, I went to Stafford, and he was great. He said, I met him in a hotel in Stafford, and he said, and it was daylight. It was in the middle of the day or late morning, and he said, right, come with me. And he said, I'm going to show you Climax. And he lives in Spain, and he was over visiting his family, and I tied it up to go and meet him in Stafford. And he had a car, and we literally, first of all, he took me to the rehearsal places where Walton Village Hall, where it was like Mecca to me. Wow, this is where they first started. And he then took me to the primary school at Renton, I think it was, where they rehearsed for this album, Rich Man, which was the first album to feature John Cuffley. And then he said, right, now I'm going to, which was fantastic. And he said, right, now I'm going to take you round the circuit that I had to do to pick everyone up. So we went off to these villages around Stafford, and he said, this is where Colin Cooper lived, and this is where Pete lived, and this is where Richard Jones or George Newsom, and by the end of it, he said, and we've been about, I mean, it was in one locality, but we'd been about probably heading for about 45 minutes, an hour. And we weren't, we were just stopping briefly, not stopping the van to open the doors to load the gear. And then eventually he says, right, now we're going to go on the motorway down to London, which obviously he didn't do. But his point was, this is what we did. and then you go to the Marquee, or you go up to Edinburgh, or you go to Cardiff, or you go to Norwich, and you have to drive back. Weren't too many hotels in Britain,
And sometimes longer, because they had to wait for him to finish his homework when he was young, didn't they?
Yeah.
He wasn't allowed to play his
Yeah,
guitar until he'd done his homework.
yeah. But they didn't often play in your side of the border, but when they did, they played in Glasgow, I think, a couple of times. They drive home, back to Stafford, and they were a road band. And I think the thing they loved most of all in the States, and I've got a picture of, if I may, Graham, just the second volume of the book. The second volume. This is not too much light on this. This was taken in their bus, and you can see it. You can see it's got a TV screen, and this is I can't go. That's Pete Filial. Pete, who was a keyboards player, he joined them in the mid to late 70s. He went out to Montserrat. Just up to behind him is Pete, just out of shot. This is a roadie and their driver, I think. This is Tony Brinsley, the manager. Derek Holt. Oh, main roadie, they loved him. His name escapes me just for the moment. No, it's gone. They'll kill me for that. John Cuffley and Colin. And this was a photograph taken by Bo Overlock in the bus that they finally had to tour around. There's sort of quite a nice bus, with comfortable beds and bunks. And this is when they kind of they made it really as far as they could. And this is what was brilliant about the States. And when they got back to the UK, it was a transit. and so yeah.
And everyone thought they were an American band by then, right?
Everybody thought they were an American band. Pete, everyone thought he was an American guitarist. He did an interview. They obviously periodically do obviously promotional interviews on US radio stations. And there was one occasion when Pete went in. In fact, this interview survives on vinyl. But anyway, he goes in, and it's a female interviewer. And the first thing she said, "Geez, you're not American, you're British." And he sits there in his Stafford accent, again, rather modestly, and sort of says, yes. And everyone thought he was American. And he did, as I said, he played up to that with the Volino guitar and all the rings and Mexican silver.
Yeah. And that guitar did become something of an iconic part of his. Lots of people made it. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
and it was a
I don't. To the point that Miles Copeland recognised it as a kind of brand, if you like. I don't know if that's the right word, but there's the guitar with Colin Cooper's Boucher, I think, stats, and it was a very distinctive. And this was the gold-plated album, and it was a very unfortunately, the C of Climax is just obscuring this distinctive V-shaped headstock. But he had 2 or 3 of those, and he also had what was called a Volino Traveller, which was a tiny little version of the same aluminium guitar made by this guy called John Volino, who had worked for Boeing or one of the American aircraft companies. So we used to work. He was an aero engineer, and he worked with aluminium, and he just made guitar. He made a mailbox out of aluminium, and then I can't remember the exact story, but he knew a musician, and someone said, "Oh, can you make a guitar? Or why don't you make a guitar?" Or he had the idea to do it, and he did it. And then he made this little tiny version, like a little square body with a very short fretboard, and B.B. King had one, and using on airplanes and coaches to rehearse. And there was a tour around Europe called Star Trek in '75, which was like a sort of great flying circus set up by Miles Copeland to fly his group of his bands around Europe. So it was Wishbone Ash, Renaissance, Climax. Lou Reed was supposed to headline it, or Curved Air. Lou Reed didn't show up for various reasons. So at the last minute, Ike and Tina Turner, who were touring Europe at the time, came on as headliners. And Ike Turner saw Pete's little mini Volino Traveller and wanted it. I don't think Pete let him have it. Don't think so. So yeah, there are photographs of him playing it. If you Google Pete Haycock, you invariably come across a picture of it. It's a peculiar. He did have a penchant for distinctive guitars, and of course he loved playing slide. He loved slide, blues slide. He has a composition he wrote a piece called Country Hat, and Country Hat was a standard piece they would play on stage, and yeah, he loved the slide, which started in his Mason Dixon days.
And that Country Hat often kind of morphed into "Come On in My Kitchen," didn't it?
Come On in My Kitchen, the song, yeah. Which I mean, it's the dual sax, Colin on sax and Pete on guitar was the sort of almost conversation between the two of them was their sort of party trick, and it just works so well.
It's beautiful, and it stands out. So for my radio show in June, because I've been in there for 5 years, I did Robert Johnson specials, and they must be Robert Johnson songs, some of the most covered music of all time.
Yeah.
Lots of people know the songs; they've never heard of Robert Johnson, but they've heard Clapton, they've heard someone else, and there's so many to try and pick one of each to play. But in the midst of a really crowded space, Pete Haycock said really, and Colin it stands out.
Well, it's
pretty beautiful.
May I ask a question? Do you think you would ever do, given what you just said about the Robert Johnson repertoire, do you think you'd ever do another? Is there room for another program? Because it's a great concept. And
of the Robert Johnson one.
Yeah.
So it ended up, believe it or not, I ended up doing 3.
Oh, did you? Oh, right.
It took hours because I thought I'll not take that long. Excuse me. So I basically went through, and of course for the radio you have to own all the songs, but you can listen to them. So I listened to them all through Amazon Music, and then the ones that you want to play, you have to buy and download and all that stuff. But I ended up with hours and hours worth for every single Robert Johnson song, and Come On in My Kitchen. I mean, Love in Vain, I thought, well, there's the Rolling Stones, but I think I ended up playing the Kev Moe version. So yes, but there's definitely more room for that kind of thing. Those are the 3 that I put on Mixcloud.
I know that Kev Moe version. I've got it, and it's a great. It's almost it's very haunting, very quite. It's almost dark. Robert Johnson, isn't it? It's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Even the Simply Red ones. So I'd never heard them before, but on the album Stars, there's like a deluxe edition, and it's only Mick Hucknall. There's no instrument. It's just him singing, and it's super haunting. Come On in My Kitchen.
Really, I'll have to dig that out. Oh, and he's on his own. He's on his own. He's just wow.
Yeah, it's just his voice, and it really showcases the quality of them. And I don't listen to a lot of Simply Red, but you can listen to that and argue with the quality of that man's voice. It's superb. No. And also you get this again with Pete when they play these cover versions. They definitely understand the song. They understand Robert Johnson's emotional state or what he's trying to communicate, and that comes through. And I think the way, not just in vocals, but the way that Pete plays the guitar.
Yes, I think the same with Otis Rush's So Many Roads. I think what Pete does with that is it's a blues, and when he plays, he respects the blues, he respects the original, and he's elevating the original, but he's also turning it into something else. If that makes sense, there's something much more to it. And I never get tired of. I mean, I've heard several versions of "Come On in My Kitchen." In fact, again, if one, I'm not allowed to say this, but if one goes onto YouTube, there's, I don't know if you've seen it. There's a clip at Glastonbury when the band played at Glastonbury in about 80. It's Colin Cooper, Pete Haycock, John Cuffley, Rhino Edwards is on bass, I think, because Derek's gone. So it must be about 83, something like that. Whenever they Glastonbury in the early 80s, and they're on the Pyramid stage with a big peace sign that's there, and Pete does Country Hat and then segues into Common in My Kitchen, and it is just stunning. You know, there's been times when people say, well, who is Pete Haycock? And I just say, well, just watch this. And then they get it.
They're just able to somehow elevate, not elevate their game. But there's something, it's almost to not be too kind of sentimental about it. People talk about it's like the spirit of Robert Johnson inhabits for a while. For that song.
I think it does. I mean, certainly, I think it does. I think those guys, whether it's Johnson or Rush, I mean, there's a wonderful version on one of Pete's solo albums when he was with Pete Haycock band after he left Climax, of B.B. King's "When the Thrill Is Gone," and Mike Stevens, who was a saxophone player, or is a saxophone player, if memory serves me right, he plays flute on that. Flute. Clive Maiayu is playing drums. And Pete plays the song quite traditionally. And then he hands over to Mike Stevens and Clive Maiayu. And there's this kind of long instrumental. It's not actually a jam. It is a bit of a jam, but it just takes it's just, you know, and I'm a bit of a blues purist. You know, I've got some really old scratchy stuff which I listen to now and again, and then I go and blast out with Stevie Ray Vaughan. But to me, the whole thing is blues. This particular song, they play When the Thrill Is Gone, and it's just utterly different. It is it's a live album. It was recorded in a bar in a town called Pirmasens in Germany. And it's about 11 or 12 minutes long, if I recall. And it's an album called Live in It, by the Pete Haycock Band. And this version of When the Thrill Is Gone is just superb. It's wonderful. And just takes the song to another level. And then Pete pulls it back to the blues. And the musicians that played with Pete in his post-Climax bands all said that the modestness again, he stepped back and let them do their thing. He wanted them to go forward. He was there. He would play whatever Pete did. You know, he did his thing. But he always wanted them to go forward and to do their thing. Again, possibly because he'd just done it. You know, he'd seen it all. He'd done it all. And possibly, again, because he'd been bitten by the business and he just didn't want to take the limelight anymore. As I say, a little bar in Germany with maybe, you know, 50, 60, a couple of hundred people in the audience at the most, just playing blues. That's where I think he found happiness. Yeah.
Maybe would feel connected to that whole almost juke joint.
Yeah.
Authenticity is the word they use for blues, isn't it?
Yeah. I just a shame we lost him, and it's just I just wonder, always the big question always is what would he be doing now? Where would he be? I mean, as you said, he'd be in his 70s. mid-70s, but I don't think that would stop him. I mean, Derek Holt's still playing.
Yeah, there's plenty of folk going on well in the 70s, even the 80s now.
Yeah. I mean, Colin was touring right up towards, close to when he died. John Cuffley, I was very privileged to be invited to John's 80th birthday up in Staffordshire. He had a party. My God, he was drumming, telling jokes, just incredible. And they're all Richard Jones, the keyboardist, Anton Farmer, who was a keyboards player, recently, composed an amazing instrumental album, a sort of sci-fi type music for almost like a film score music. George Newsom, I believe, is still playing locally. He lives in Cornwall. He's still playing drums. Pete Filial writes and is a songwriter. They're just good musicians. You can't keep them down. It's yeah.
I mean, having read the book, I very quickly began to share your passion for making sure that he's not forgotten. So doing the blues show as part of the Independent Blues Broadcasters Association, I get sent a lot of music, but of course nobody sends me stuff that was written in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. It's all new stuff, and there's a lot of really great stuff. But we lose something if we detach ourselves from where we've come from. So I don't know if you want to say anything to. So and for folks who are watching, we've got 5 folk watching just now, and hopefully others later on. The book is really detailed. The amount of effort, the amount of articles and interviews that you must have read. It's very much a labour of love. There's so many great photographs of it, including his beautiful guitar, and it's nice because the photographs, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kind of chunks of photograph pages or so, and you get
the
to
book
watch age.
So
yeah. So if you want to say a little bit how people can get it if they want to.
Yeah, I self-published this. I didn't go to ABC Publishing Megacorp. It's all my own work. I self-published it because I wanted to retain control. I run a small book production business, which helps. And my associate down in Sydney, Australia, did all the design work. And it's available through my own website, which is moonshineeditions.com. Moonshine, sorry, off screen. Hang on. Let's get the thing round. Nice picture of Pete on the back. Moonshine Editions. There you go. And it's moonshineeditions.com. And you can buy it directly from me. Thank you, Graham. You can get it from me, and it'll come straight from me, and I ship all over the world. And it's a very limited edition. The numbers are low. Quite a few have gone already. There is a few left. So yeah.
We'll put the website in the description below.
Thank you. Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say, we hadn't spoken this beforehand, but we can also put in the playlist. So I asked Robert beforehand to prepare a list. So when I do a radio show around Pete and his life, it may end up being 2 actually, because there's just so much to talk about, so many good songs. So the playlist, 1 or 2 we've already spoken about, the ones that you suggested, Robert. So Little Walter, My Babe, Otis Rush, Satisfied. What ones? Other ones? We also mentioned How Many More Years from the Climax Chicago Blues Band album '69, and then other ones you had mentioned.
Yeah, I chose, first of all, just come back to Otis Rush. I chose Otis Rush because So Many Roads was his song, and it was a really big part of Pete's personal repertoire, and I wanted to mark that by obviously finding something else representative of Otis Rush by Otis Rush, because Pete was, liked, he was a fan of Otis Rush, who was a Southpaw guitarist. Graham Bond, he was very influenced by Graham Bond. I've also picked a track from the album Reel to Reel, which is this album, which was recorded in Montserrat at the Air Studios in Montserrat. and there's a ballad, a blues ballad called "Fallen in Love for the Very Last Time," which I think is an absolutely beautiful song. We talked about How Many More Years, a track from the album Rich Man, I think it is, Shake Your Love, which is a real bone shaker. I wanted to showcase what the band sounded like pre-1975. Rollin' Home came from the Gold Plated album, which is a blues, and that album was very successful for the band. And then in terms of his solo work, Clone Shuffle, which is a real groove, from his album called Biker's Dozen, which was an album that came together through his association and work with the aforementioned Reg Godwin, his webmaster, and Jeff Byler, who runs the Facebook appreciation page. It's an excellent track. So Many Roads on True Blues. Oh, you got to play that, man. That's Pete. So it was difficult. It was difficult to. And Climax Blues Band is a live version of. We were talking about a Country Hat going into "Come On in My Kitchen" from an album that was an independently produced album called World Tour '76, which in fact is like a misnomer because it wasn't a world tour. But there you go, they called it World Tour. So it was recorded in somewhere in the UK. I can't remember where exactly right now, but it's a great version of that song. It's probably the best actually. Personally, I think. So Many Roads by Pete Haycock's True Blues, recorded in Germany, Dusseldorf, superb. But
when you tune into a blues show, that's the sound you're hoping to hear.
Yes,
that's what I think, anyway.
Yes, but it was difficult picking those tracks to be representative of the man and his music. It's not an easy task, and there's so many others that I could have put in and perhaps should have put in, but hey, that's it, forces you to focus.
But you can be always slightly envious if there's an artist or an act that I love, and you introduce somebody else to them for the first time, and they just start to listen, because then you think, wow, you're gonna have this all for the first time.
Yeah.
Which is I agree. Yeah. I almost wish there's some acts that I could forget about so that I could hear them for the first time again.
Yeah, I hope what encourages me having this conversation with you, Graham, is that you're right though. There is a dirt at the moment. I mean, I try to keep in touch with the current blues scene. I subscribe to a magazine called Blues in Britain, and bands like When Rivers Meet, artists like Samantha Fish, they're all sort of out there, and Troy Redfern, I think it is, and I had a very, I don't think I've got it with me at the moment. I had a very nice review of the book in Blues in Britain, but I think there's this is a difficult subject, and you're a blues broadcaster, right? It is a wide, from Robert Johnson all the way through to, When Rivers Meet. That's a big, I mean, it's great because you've got a wide, broad canvas, but I, as I said to you, I've done a bit of blues broadcasting myself, but I was able to, zero in on what I wanted to listen to. I was very fortunate. I don't know what it's like with your programming, but you've got a big canvas to choose from. And I think the Robert Johnson idea was fantastic because you're using other music to promote an original, to make people aware of an original. But it's, I think blues, I don't know. I buy a lot of box sets. I bought quite a few box sets of that 1960s, early 70s British blues boom, the dreaded, as Pete called it, the dreaded blues boom. I think it's great. I mean, there were some great bands, and there's labels like Repertoire and Esoteric, and a label called Grapefruit, and they're doing these great box sets. And there's bands that have You know, some of them are one-hit wonders, but wow, Shaky Vic. There's just loads of bands that Black Cat Bones, Steam Hammer. It was a great period, fantastic period for British blues. It is being forgotten a little bit, and that's partly because I think modern blues is now so powerful, but we are going increasingly towards rock. You know, there is fashion, I think, for, you know, Stevie Ray Vaughan, I think, is now, used to be B.B. King and Otis Rush and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. They were the kind of, and they still are the iconic, to use that word, model. But I think Stevie Ray Vaughan, you know, for the men, it's the sort of, you know, the hat and the beard and the, you know, he's now the model, and I think that's where blues is the line between blues and rock is getting blurred, possibly. But that's just
I get sent a lot of stuff that, if I'm quite honest, I don't play because it's not blues. It doesn't sound blues to me.
Yeah.
It does sound rock, and I talk about it on shows. Blues has fuzzy edges. Some stuff I get sent is country, some is folk,
Yeah.
and it's kind of different for everybody. And
Yeah.
I mean, I've got I'm sure you've seen the kind of thing before. These almost encyclopedias of blues musicians of yesteryear. And so
Amazing.
I'll try and just sometimes open them up and pick somebody that I've never heard before. And sometimes there is only maybe one surviving track.
Yeah.
But it's just nice to not forget them.
Yeah. I think the thing is, during the 60s and the 70s, the Stones, the Yardbirds, you know, bands like Climax and you know, Fleetwood Mac, they were almost in Clapton, they were all, John Mayall, they were almost disciples, and they were remaining faithful to the sound that came from the Delta in Chicago and Detroit and Texas and Florida even. I mean, you know, that they put their mark on it. And I guess maybe it's just been done. It's now been done. So the new generation of blues bands and blues artists are, you know, bringing in other influences now, mostly rock, but, you know, maybe, you know, hip hop and scratching, and, you know, there's all sorts. I don't know. You know, if you had Muddy Waters here, or Robert Johnson, what would they be saying? You know, this is great, or this ain't blues. I don't know. But as long as one way or another it keeps it alive, that's great.
I heard Joe Bonamassa once responding to criticism, and he was saying, you know, the Robert Johnsons of the world didn't want to sound scratchy. That was the best sound they could get with what they had available to them, and he was kind of therefore trying to do the same. And he's got a polarizing figure for some in blues, but there's validity in that, and it is that thing. Is it still blues? Okay, it doesn't sound like it was recorded in 1940, but that's okay. But it has to have these kind of fuzzy edges. It has, but when it strays too far, then that's fine. It's just not for my show.
I don't know about you, Graham, but I think what he says is absolutely right. I whenever I listen to Johnson, or, you know, Charlie Patton, or you know, Leadbelly or somewhere like that, I accept. I've always thought, right, the scratches are going to be there because that was then. Yeah, I mean, Bonamassa is absolutely right. You know, that's what they had to work with. That's what there was. The recording quality, you know, that was the beginning. I tend not to, and as such, I've never thought about this actually, but subconsciously, I don't listen to that. I don't hear the scratches. I hear the guy behind it or underneath and what he's trying to do. Probably it's just automatic. You know, you just think, well, this is, you know, 1935 or something, and there's going to be scratches. I don't try to. I mean, I love it nowadays with bands when they use the sort of American, what are those microphones called? You know, I can't remember. You know, and they put them up against their harmonicas and stuff to get that kind of 50s I love that. I think it's great, and they can integrate it with the modern sound. I think that's wonderful. A kind of fusion. I think that's great.
But yeah, it kind of brings back what we said
Sorry.
about Pete. It's faithful to the original, but with his own contribution.
Yeah. There was a band I did enjoy. I don't know if you've ever played their music. Sadly, they are no longer around, but there was a British band called The Hoax, and their guitarist was a guy called, one of their guitarists was a guy called John Amoore, and another guitarist they came from Wiltshire, I think, and another guitarist in The Hoax is doing well at the moment. He lives in America, and he's got a duet with an American lady blues singer. I believe I'm right in saying that. I might be wrong, but I really got into their early albums, but at the same time, they're really fun music, very electric, very heavy. But someone decided File Under Blues, and there was a blues. I think it's the kind of music Pete would have liked. It was fun, but as I said, blues was there, but it was also, I think they were representative of rock creeping in, and rock. These guys were rock musicians who realized that the blues was their basis, but they were going to stay rock musicians. That's my interpretation. I may be wrong, but they were a great band, The Hoax. If you can track some of their music, have a listen to their version of Superstition.
I will look them up.
The Hoax, Superstition. Yeah, that's good.
We've still got three folk who've stayed with us the whole last hour and a half. So I just want to,
wow.
if any
staying power.
But if anybody wants to ask a question, then you're very welcome. You still got the chat room function at the side. We had a couple other people who stayed with us and kind of dropped away about the hour and a half mark, which I think is still pretty impressive. But
wow.
One or two of them might be people who initially tuned into my channel first instance because it was whiskey. Before
I mean, if anyone gets in touch with you about it in the future and you get an email or something, let me know, and I can always email them back or something. Yeah. But I think it's great that you do what you do. And
it's part of that, keeping the blues alive, as the record label now calls it. But it's been a great blessing to me, the blues. It's
and I think it's great that you've got people like Dave Arcari up north of the border. I love him. I think he's a good guy. He's a bit of a showman. He's a good guy, though. I think he's terrific.
Oh, I saw him a couple of months ago. He plays part of the Edinburgh Blues Club. He played, and I get a chance to go, and that was the first time I'd got to speak to him. And I first saw him during COVID. He did a live on, I think it was through Facebook. It was online anyway, and it was brilliant.
He looks a really nice guy. He comes over as being a very nice guy.
He is, and I think it has that special thing where he doesn't take himself too seriously.
Exactly. Yeah. He did a version of Loch Lomond, didn't he? He's done a song. Yeah, it's fantastic. And a Whisky Rev.
It was almost. I think it was that one, and I'm willing to be proven wrong. That he said people had been saying, "Oh, I need to do a Scottish one," so he did it almost meant to be a parody. And had intended that nobody would like it, and they said everybody came up to me and said it was the best single they'd done in years or whatever. So you had to play it. Basically, his own range of nationals and things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a combination of Scottish folk and blues, isn't it? Really, it's yeah. So what are you playing at the moment? What's in? What's on the Whisky Rev?
Well, last week there's a really good album, Devon Allman, the Blues Summit, which did really well, and an album which I think is not necessarily out yet, a guy called Tom Hambridge. Like an album came out called Down the Hatch, and his last album was called, I think it was Blues Déjà Vu. But that was excellent.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just writing that down. I think I've seen him I think I've seen him mention him in the Blues magazine. I think it's a name. That name rings a bell.
Yeah. No, it's good stuff. And there's a guy who's kind of an older, well, not an old, around longer, Mick Clark.
Oh yeah,
I love his stuff. It's kind of sometimes it's a bit kind of rock and rolly blues.
Yeah. Have you played any? Not that I've even heard their music, but I was reading about them. This band called the Milkmen.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Milkmen are.
I don't know what they do, but they've set up some down here. They set up some kind of like a little mini festival of some kind. And what about Catfish?
Yeah, well, there's various kind of catfishes, but yes, because of course, Catfish Blues was originally an old blues track.
Yeah.
On the other good album that's just come out that I really like, the Blood Brothers. So Mike Zito and Albert Castiglia.
Oh yeah.
So they just got a second one. The first one was just called Blood Brothers. The second was called Help Yourself.
Yeah,
and that was one I've been really looking forward to.
And who's the guy they're advertising a lot in this magazine? I haven't got the magazine with me. Is it Wyatt? No. There's an American guy. Is it? He's I can see the adverts. Can't remember his name. He's getting a lot of promotion. But anyway, no, it's gone. It's gone.
I'm going to come back to you.
Yeah.
But Connor Selby is the new album out. The Truth Comes Out eventually.
Yeah, I like him. Yeah.
He's a master for me of the slow blues guitar solo.
See, I think Pete would have liked Connor Selby. I think.
I think he would. And then there's other ones who, whenever they bring out any music, I know that I'm going to play. So everything that comes out from Bob Corritore.
Yeah.
So he's in Phoenix now, but it's kind of Chicago blues. Or Charlie Musselwhite. Anything that.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Sorry?
I mean, he's amazing. I mean, how old is he now?
I think he's 82.
Is he?
I hope if he's younger than that, he doesn't inadvertently tune into this. But I think
there was a Chicago blues man. I think I don't know if he's still with us, but I couldn't believe it. I was listening to this guy back in the 80s, a guy called John Primer, who played with
the Muddy Waters band.
He was with Muddy Waters, and he was more. And then he went to another Chicago guy, someone slim. Anyway, and then I bought he did a great solo a debut solo album, and I bought a couple of his albums, and then I heard, and then I couldn't believe it. He popped up recently, and I thought, my God, he's still making albums.
It would have been Memphis Slim.
Memphis Slim, possibly, yeah.
Alongside Memphis. So he actually came to Edinburgh. Let me see if I can.
Who, John Primer did?
He came to Edinburgh about 18 months ago, along with Bob Corritore, and it was billed as the Edinburgh Blues Club night. It was called Legend of Chicago Blues, and it really was something spectacular because he's one of these guys. He steps onto the stage, and he had a kind of cherry red Gibson. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
Wow. It was pretty much on the front row, and he just walked onto stage. The first, you can probably tell from that how chuffed I am to be next to him.
Recognize his face as well. Yeah.
You know, it's like, can you take a selfie? And he just kind of looked. You know, I don't think that was a normal. But Legends of Chicago Blues, he picked up the Gibson, plays the first. It wasn't recorded, just the slide note, and the whole place just went, wow.
Did it? Yeah.
So and it was, again, you don't like to be worried that you don't know how many or more opportunities you'll get to see these people.
There's a book which, if you haven't read it, you must read it. Have you ever heard of a book called Waiting for Buddy Guy? Chicago Blues at the Crossroads by Alan Can't read his name. Hang on a minute, let's have a look. It's Alan Harper. He's an English guy. It's a fascinating story. He was absolutely devoted to Chicago blues. I mean, the book came out in the early noughties, I think. And he just took off. He was a student, I think, or he was a young guy, and he just took off to Chicago. And this white guy, English white guy, and he just went round the bars of Chicago, and everyone said, "You're mad. You're going to get beaten up. You're going to get robbed. You're going to, it's going to be awful. The police are going to, and it's the story of how he met these guys in the late 90s, I think it was, when blues was a bit on its knees, but there still were these clubs on the west side and the south side in Chicago, and he went, he met people like John Primer and just went around the clubs and just ended up talking to these guys because they were intrigued. They said, what's this white cat doing here, from Devon or Cornwall or something. And he ended up becoming friends with 2 or 3 of them. And in fact, I think one guy came out, he found a guy, a young guitarist, and they became pals. And the guy came over to England and did a little mini tour of England. And it's a great book. It's called Waiting for Buddy Guy, Chicago.
I've looked it up. I've just had it on order.
Yeah, get it. It's a great read. You'll love it. It's a really nice book.
Because somebody's in the 60s when some of them were rediscovered. So like when Son House, when he was rediscovered, he was amazed that he didn't know anybody was listening to his music.
Well, there's another. This is a subject for another program. We should do this. Talk about blues books, and then you can play music related to the book. That's a pro. Because
we should do that.
Yeah, we should do that. We should do that another time because I've got a hell of a library of blues biographies and blues books. So much Britain, America, and we can talk about it. And then you can play tracks related to the book. But have you read that book? I can't remember its name, but it's about it's about the guys that went and found Son House. It's got them. It's on the cover. I think there's a picture. There's a black and white picture, and it's Pee Wee Clayton or somebody on the cover. I can't remember.
I think it's called Preaching the Blues.
It might be. That's it. I think it's it, and it's about those three guys who tracked him down. Or maybe there's 2 books, and I'm getting them a bit muddled up. But it's a wonderful story. Wonderful story.
Yeah, I thought it was there. I've got it somewhere, but and Blind Willie McTell, when they found him, he was playing in a car park.
Yeah, in a car park
for pennies.
Find Me My Traveling Shoes or something. It's called. That's a good book.
Hand me my traveling shoes.
Yeah,
you did as well.
Yeah, that's a great book. It's so sad that he was playing in a car park.
Oh
yeah. It's and then all this revisionism now about the father and son who did all the field recordings.
Lomax.
Yeah. There's this thing about did it all really happen, and then the means with which they got them and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, I read what Land Where the Blues Began by Alan Lomax, I think it is. And I think it's a good story.
The Buddy Guy autobiography.
Yeah.
Did you know that? But that what he says. He was playing. He was doing 3 jobs, and he was playing in these studios, and he didn't realize then he was making any money from his recordings until somebody said, "That's a good copyright." After they finished, he went, "Great, good, we've got it's a good copyright," and that was because I think he was working as a driver, as a janitor, as a builder. People were making all this money out of his music. No idea.
I thought that was probably. I really enjoyed that book. That was one of the better autobiographies.
Why I Left Home. That's what it was called.
That's it. I'm just about to read. There's an American white blues guitarist who played with the later versions of Muddy Waters bands. The final, I can't remember his name. I think it might be a sort of Italian sounding name. Anyway, it's a very short book. It's a paperback, and I'm just about to start reading it. He was, you'll recognize the name. It's in another room. I won't go and get it. But that had quite a good review, and I'm looking forward to reading it. So he's one of the Muddy's last guitarists, I think. He was a white guy, and he's written a memoir about being on the road with Muddy Waters in those final years. Yeah.
Good stuff. We should probably wrap. There's still 2 people who are with us, which is
wow. They should have a medal.
whoever you are who are watching, thank you so much. I don't know whether it's still Don or Past Whiskey from California, but yeah. So it takes like a day or 2 before StreamYard put it onto YouTube and makes it fully accessible, and then we'll put underneath in the description a link to your site, Robert, for the book, and then we'll put for people who want to listen to get a sample of Pete Haycock, and we'll put the list of those tracks.
And you think you'll get all those tracks will get in, will they? Do you think, or
we'll probably I'll record the show.
How long is your program, Graham? Sorry,
57 minutes.
Ah,
so it might have to be 2. It might have to be over 2 programs, and that'll take me a couple of weeks to put that together.
Yeah.
I think it's worth it, because again, there's nothing wrong with being tribute, and we can intersperse 1 or 2 other things with it as well.
Do you get to the? I think you said to me when we first started talking some time ago, the station gives you sort of freedom to cut.
Yeah. We get carte blanche to do it. For Mixcloud, what I'll probably do is take the audio from this, and then I'll maybe cut off the bit that we've enjoyed chatting about other blues things at the end, and then just to condense it to the Pete Haycock and Climax stuff, and then edit that and put it on Mixcloud. I don't think there's a limit on Mixcloud, and I'll put all the songs in. I'll just double check again that we don't inadvertently, because if they detect, I think it's 3 by the same artist in proximity, then they don't allow that. But we can play around with all of that, even if we end up playing some samples.
Yeah. Well, if you need any more music, let me know. Now that I know how to convert Max AICC, whatever it is, into MP3, so now I know. If you need anything else, just let me know.
Well, I'll hit end stream just now, and then I'll just say cheerio to you. So thank you to the 2 people who have been joining us. I hope I guess you must have enjoyed it. You wouldn't hang around for an hour and 57 minutes or whatever it is if you weren't getting something from it. Yes, and we'll stay posted, tuned to the channel, buy the book. Yes, we'll see you again, all being well.